Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to jump right into today's topic, which is the recent federal court ruling that said the Emergencies Act was ruled unconstitutional. And, from a curious mind's perspective, what I'm really interested in is what does this mean? And we've heard a lot on social media. Well, on some social media platforms more than other, we've heard a lot about is it the right decision? We know that the federal government, the Liberal government, is going to appeal the decision. So, what I wanted to do was bring on someone that I was actually on a show with recently, Tom Marazzo, who also has just written a book. And we're going to talk a bit about that as well. And what I want to ask is, what does this court decision mean for people that were involved in the convoy in Ottawa? And we're going to look at what the decision means, a little bit of background on my guest and his role with the convoy, and then finally, maybe looking at what next. So here we are. I want to welcome Tom Marazzo. We had up your book. So I was very intrigued by that. So we'll get to that and talk a little bit more about that, because that's sort of the backdrop to the court decision today this week. So for people tuning in that maybe have very little knowledge about, we thought the convoy was over and done with. We had a commission, and everybody seemed to think maybe that the convoy was long over with. But here we had a federal court ruling that the Emergencies Act that was put in by the Liberal government, that it was ruled unconstitutional, and a whole bunch of other things that was said. So can you give a bit of context, Tom, of as someone who was at the convoy, and what this means to you?
Sure. And thank you for having me on, Gail. I really do appreciate that. And it's, you brought up the Emergency Commission, and that was just over a year ago, the Public Order Emergency Commission that lasted 7 weeks. I also was subpoenaed to testify at that, but I also attended every day with the legal team that was representing the Freedom Convoy. And this decision 2 days ago is a different thing altogether, but they are very, very closely related, but there are some significant differences. So the Public Order Emergency Commission last year that Judge Rouleau had ruled on, and he had ruled in favor of the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. That is a commission. That is not a court decision. That is not legally binding, where there was let's say, a consequence to that. Okay, this is a commission to discover what steps that the government took, and what was their thinking, why did they invoke it, and so it doesn't even meet sort of a standard for becoming referenced as precedent for other court decisions in the future. This thing that we heard 2 days ago was a federal judge who presided over a judicial review. And for, those who don't know, a judicial review is kind of like suing the government. The government does something, and so as a citizen or an organization, you've got the right to file a judicial review, and you got a very short window of time to be able to do that. 2 people that participated in the convoy, which is Eddie Cornell and Vince Gerses. Eddie Cornell is retired artillery soldier in the Canadian Army. Vince Gerses is a retired OPP officer, so he's a police officer for 34 years. They both launched a judicial review, and we heard the results 2 days ago. And they took to the government to court, and they said, you broke the law. You didn't have the right to do what you did. And what we've seen now is a federal judge agreed with that finding. Not only did they break the law by invoking the Emergencies Act, they also violated Canadians' Charter of Rights, and more importantly, they operated outside of the scope of the law. And so this is what the finding was from this federal judge 2 days ago. Now, of course, the Liberals have said they'll appeal it. We're going into an election year, so of course they have to. And I think the reason they're going to appeal this is because if they can frame this as still an open-ended question in the minds of liberal voters, they'll try to frame it as something that's not definitively been settled. Therefore, we can wordsmith this a little bit here. This may influence voters, but the fact remains, the Liberal government of Canada has been embroiled in far too many scandals. Okay, just too many scandals. And this is just another one. And I mean, this is a pretty big deal. Like this is not something that should be downplayed. They literally broke the law. They violated Canadian Charter of Rights, and a federal judge has said so. Now, it's going to go to a federal court of appeal, and after this, it could go to the Supreme Court of Canada. But again, if it goes to the Supreme Court of Canada, the government's in a bind again, because the Chief Justice Wagner has already publicly, during the convoy, come out and said some pretty disparaging comments about the convoy. So they're in a situation where now the Supreme Court is going to be tied up because the Chief Justice himself cannot hear this case. He's going to have to recuse himself because he's already sort of biased the actual court itself. So, overall, this decision is very different than the commission because it's legally binding. It does set precedent. It's going to have an impact on all current court cases that are in court right now. Tamara Leach, Chris Barber are being charged with mischief. There are several other people that were charged. Harold Jonker, he's another person in Niagara, 15 months after the convoy, was charged with almost the same charges as Kristen and Tamara. You have hundreds of other Canadians that were charged. And like myself, there are about 280 Canadians who had their bank accounts frozen and their financial assets seized under the authority of the Emergencies Act. And now we're finding a judge has said, you didn't have the right to do that. You've now seized people's bank accounts illegally. So what is the repercussion of that going to be used or mean for Canadians? So it's a pretty complicated situation the government's put themselves in.
Well, again, from a curiosity perspective, when I saw this case, I definitely had many questions about what does it mean. And one of the things, and I think you have talked about this, and I'm interested in hearing more on this, is that this is not a case that's related to the science or related to mandates or related to vaccine, anything. This is strictly on the use of the actions related to the protests. And it's a strictly a legal issue. And one thing, I find about the law and these things is that sometimes there's not a lot of gray. Sometimes there's gray area, but this seems to be that it's fairly clear from a legal perspective. Can you give context for people that may be tuning in and wondering, like, okay, wait a minute, so whether you liked or disliked mandates, whether you liked or disliked the protest, can you talk about that, the legal case?
Yeah, so there's a couple of layers to this onion, and it's a very, very important question that you're asking. Okay, I participated in the convoy myself. I was there for 22 of the 24 days that the convoy was in Ottawa. Okay, I'm an educated person. I have a master's degree. I have an undergrad degree. I have an engineering background. I served in the Canadian Army for 25 years. I was a college professor. Okay, so I'm not talking about credentials to just say, I think I know better. What I'm saying is many, many, many people like me, including a lot of veterans, doctors, teachers, all walks of life participated in this convoy. And from our perspective, one thing that doesn't get spoken about often at all, I think is left out of the conversation is why. Why did so many Canadians go to Ottawa in the first place? Why did so many people line highways all over Canada in overpasses to support the convoy in its route to Canada? It was because we all believed that the government was violating the law. Okay, and what I mean by this is we have this thing in most Western civilized countries that there's a thing called informed consent. Informed consent is a two-part formula. Okay. You must always be informed of the risks of undergoing any form of medical procedure. Everybody who's ever seen a doctor and had to sign a waiver, you're participating in informed consent. This is the legal authority that authorizes a doctor to perform a medical procedure on you. That's for medications, procedures, operations, whatever. Informed consent throughout the COVID-19 pandemic was impossible to meet. Okay, it was impossible. And just so viewers know that one of the major vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines that was given to Canadians, the phase 3 clinical trial just concluded last month. So this entire time, the public who's taken many of these vaccines are still participating in a phase 3 clinical trial. So we do trials in order to meet the standard of informed consent. Now, what does informed mean? It means we know the risks, we know the percentages, we know what can happen to you if you undergo a medication or procedure or anything. Well, without the clinical trials being done, and I mean, it takes on average between 7 to 10 years for a vaccine to get through all the clinical trials and get approved by Health Canada. That never took place. It didn't take place. And so, yeah, you could say there's an emergency, but we also knew that there wasn't an emergency. The numbers were not there even in the first couple of months of before the vaccine came out. The case count was different than actual ICU or admissions or even deaths related to COVID. And we all know by now the numbers were largely manipulated. My whole point is that so many people went to Ottawa, into Windsor, into Coutts and all this because they knew the government was not meeting informed consent. Therefore, the mandates they were imposing on people to keep their jobs. And by the way, I got fired because I pushed back against the COVID-19 mandates that my college imposed on me. And, you know, if anyone really wants to look at another layer of the law, 176C of the Criminal Code of Canada says coercion is criminal assault. And so if you were told that you would, if you did not get this medical intervention, that you would lose your job, that's actually criminal assault that your employer committed against you. Okay, so I looked at it from an informed consent point of view, and I looked at it from a coercion point of view. This is extortion, okay? And the government's doing it to you and then saying it's okay when we do it. But if anyone else does it, we're going to bring the full, force and effect of law enforcement. So a lot of people went to Canada saying, you're violating my rights and we know it. You're not meeting the standards of, just bodily autonomy. That's a big issue. So really, the convoy was a genesis, or it was a manifestation of all of the decisions that every level of government in this country made against the people, against their wishes. And to remember, people in Canada were protesting for 2 years before the convoy arrived in Ottawa. And no government was listening. No government. And finally, when they attacked the truckers said, okay, we have a different, unique ability to now make an impact. So the truckers went to Ottawa, and they went to Ottawa with the assistance of law enforcement. They were assisted. They were actually driven into all the spots that we were in Ottawa. We were actually led into those positions in the streets in Ottawa by the police. Okay.
That's a really interesting point. Because I was also watching through social media, which was interesting because I didn't see so much in other media. It was more through social. I was following this as people were coming across Canada. And one of the questions I had, I wondered why I thought Ottawa would be setting up barricades and setting up planning for this, because if you had been, I guess, with an ear to the ground following this, they're probably, I know myself, I thought this is not going to be a small group. And I actually said to someone, I said, they're going to be there for a while. And people, no, it'll be a weekend and they're gone. And so, you come from a military background. So maybe that seemed to be very strange to me that there wasn't a plan.
We heard testimony during the commission last year that the government believed that we'd only be there for a weekend. And I'm like, how could you have possibly had that conclusion in your mind. Like, nobody's going to take a week to a week and a half to drive from BC or Newfoundland, arrive in Ottawa for 2 days, and then go home. Like, there was a certain there were many blind spots in the thinking of the government and law enforcement at the time. But I want to emphasize this, that the original convoy participants who organized this, all throughout all steps, were in constant communication right across the country with law enforcement to guide all of the convoys that came from every direction into the city of Ottawa. They landed in those spots in Ottawa. They were placed there, guided in by the police. Okay. And then we were in constant contact with the police. Now, I arrived at the convoy 2 days after it got to Ottawa. I wasn't one of the originals. I was asked because people that I knew I was military, thought that I could help, because once they arrived, there was, a sustainment plan that needed to be put in place. So I was asked to go. Within 3 hours. I was in Ottawa. And one of the first things I did when I arrived is I got a map and I said, where is all the critical infrastructure, like hospitals, police, fire departments, ambulance locations? Where is all this critical infrastructure? We circled it on a map. And then we said, we must, in the city of Ottawa, keep safety lanes open at all times for emergency services to get to any Ottawa citizen at any time. We achieved that, and this was testified to by law enforcement and by other emergency service people during the commission. Okay, and I want to raise another important fact. From the time the convoy arrived in Ottawa until the day that the police started to do mass arrests on the 18th of February, 2022, there was only 5 arrests for violent crime in the city of Ottawa, and crime overall was down 90%. And where did I get those numbers? The police in Ottawa testified to those numbers during the commission last year. There was no violent crime in the city of Ottawa until the 18th and 19th of February, when the police in this country decided to attack unarmed, peaceful protesters. And that is a fact. That was testified to at the commission by law enforcement.
You know what's interesting about that, and one of the things, again, about why my Curious Mind show is that I always want to dig deeper and look beyond just the headlines and beyond the quick clips we're reading or seeing, because, I often said sometimes perception and emotion can sometimes overrule data. And much like the case of the fire arson, right? And I went and looked into that, and yes, that was not set by someone from the convoy, but people still believe that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do believe it, because even a year ago, Jagmeet Singh was going on and talking about alleged arson. They use the term, and I saw all of the NDP and the Liberal members of Parliament and some of the Bloc use the term alleged arson. It was a repeated talking point. It was a issued talking point. You're going to go on the in front of the media or in the House of Commons, and you're going to use the phrase alleged arson, and you're going to attribute it to us. Why would you use the word alleged? First of all, why are you talking about an ongoing police investigation? Why are you making the accusation that it was tied to the convoy? Because later on, even, the legacy media had to do retractions and say, actually, it turns out this was an isolated incident that had nothing to do with the convoy. Same thing with us stealing money from, food from the homeless. I'm sorry, but we had so much food donated to the convoy that was coming in truckloads. We couldn't consume the food. We were giving it to homeless shelters. We weren't taking it. The number of lies that the legacy media told. Rodney Palmer, who worked for the CBC for 20 years, he worked all over the world for CBC. He testified at the National Citizens Inquiry, and he said it was shocking to see the lies that the legacy media was telling about it. Like, all they had to do, in fact, he said in Ottawa, to go from their building to the parking lot was a farther walk for CBC journalists than it would have been to go from their building to go out to the protest and speak to us. And they didn't. And so this complicit desire of the liberal funded media in this country to frame a story that somehow the convoy was a bunch of white supremacists, misogynists, and whatever it is that Justin Trudeau said about us is completely false. And the fifth estate in this country did nothing to counter those statements or hold the government account, which is what their job is. Their job is to hold the government to account. They didn't. They didn't do any of that. They just fell in line and they demonized everybody at the convoy. Many of the people who participated at the convoy were veterans, myself included, and many other combat veterans that were, combat veterans from the war in Afghanistan and in Bosnia were there supporting the convoy. Peaceful protesters. Okay. And that's who attended.
Mm-hmm. And I know I also interviewed people. One of the reasons that I trying to step back and look at this case a bit differently is that I did interview people that went there. One person I interviewed, which was interesting, had gone up there with gift cards, like so they could get food, and he was told, no, we don't get any more food. There was too much food, and it's shocking because now we hear about what's happening with food shortages and shelters and such. And when the convoy was there was actually so much food that people. So this did seem to be a disconnect between what we were hearing and what was actually happening on the ground in terms of that. So that's some context. We had the protest. Now I'm also interested in looking if I always say the tables can get turned. So when you use an emergency act, when you use any form of whatever tool in your toolbox, right? What will happen under different governments? So if now a precedent's been set with the Emergency Act, but now we have a precedent with the federal court. And so the question I have is that always, if we were to put conservative instead of liberal, if we were talking about conservative government doing this versus liberal, would there be any difference in how it would be viewed? And that as a longtime journalist who likes to often avoid too much partisanship, I always like to say, fill in the blank with a different government. How would it be perceived? So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because if you look at just the province of Ontario, the province of Alberta, I mean, you've got many conservative governments that are in each of the provinces during the time of COVID. Look at Doug Ford here in Ontario. Doug Ford, he campaigns as a conservative, but he has certainly always behaved like he was a liberal. He has always governed like a liberal. He's into the woke ideology on an extreme level, which, by the way, a lot of the woke ideology that's going through our education system was written by NDP MPPs in the province and adopted by Doug Ford in his government and pushed through. In Ontario now, it is against the law because of Bill 100 for you to have a protest with a vehicle if you go anywhere near critical infrastructure. And this is something he put into place right after the convoy. There's many things that the conservative provincial governments did that were very much in line with exactly what the federal Liberal Party was doing. And so from my point of view, I would say that I would qualify as a recovering liberal. Okay, over the last 4 years, I would say I would qualify it as that. Not an extreme lefty, but I like to say that I was somewhere in the middle up to the pandemic. And I'm not too far to the right either. I think that there are extremes on both sides, and I don't belong to either one of those camps. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think that the government should spend less of our money on frivolous things, but give you a helping hand for the rest of it. Keep the hospitals open, fund your military, have law enforcement, have a decent rule of law, but leave us alone. Just leave us alone and stop offering us a government-assisted suicide. I think that's pretty appalling. But I've often said before that had the conservative government been in power at the beginning of the convoy, they would have probably done exactly what the Liberal government did. To, more or a lesser extreme, I'm sure. But I think the evidence is clear that even conservative governments, liberal governments all across the country, they all behaved in the same exact manner. What's disturbing is that every single province in Canada has an organization dedicated to handling emergencies. In Ontario, it's called Emergency Management Ontario. The reason I know this is because when I was posted to the Army's headquarters in Toronto from 2008 to 2010, I participated in the G8, G20 summit when you saw Toronto get ripped apart by, the Black Bloc, which is now called Antifa. I sat beside the representative. So every morning, the general there, he gets his morning briefing and all the senior staff are there. And I was filling in. I used to fill in for my boss all the time. I was a junior officer there. And I sat beside a retired brigadier general who is the liaison to Emergency Management Ontario. Okay. Now let me explain how EMO works, because every single province has one of these organizations. They exist to handle emergencies on behalf of a premier. Okay. They coordinate with law enforcement, the banking industry, education, religion, medical, military. They coordinate for everybody. They devise a plan. And to use the analogy of a bicycle wheel, okay, in the center of the hub is your emergency management organization. All of those other organizations that I named, they're just spokes in the wheel. They all coordinate into EMO. They are the ones who put the premier, the elected official, in a position to make decisions. That is their job, to disseminate all that information, create information briefings, and then decision briefings, and then go to the premier and say, as the elected official, this is the decision we're looking for from you to take these actions. Okay. That never happened in this entire country. All of the emergency management organizations in this country were sidelined. What did they do? They took a spoke out of the wheel, which was the medical, our medical institutions, our chief medical officers, and said, you're now no longer a spoke, you're now the hub and the wheel. And what did they do? They only knew the one thing that they were experts at, which is the medical system, and they were put in charge of the economy, mental health, religion, law enforcement, and these people did catastrophic damage to the entire country. They were put in these positions by the premiers for God knows why, and nobody understands why this ever happened. These organizations still exist, and they were all benched. You can do a master's degree in emergency management at the University of York, and I think out in Alberta. I can't comprehend to this day why every level of government did these things. It's illogical, irresponsible, and a lot of people were harmed drastically by this. Okay. These are all the things that contributed to the reason, the manifestation of why the convoy existed to begin with. Nobody talked to the people, and we were being ignored and arrested. The protests were being ignored. Finally, when they went after the truckers, you know why the truckers had enough? Because they said, if you are a trucker and you cross into the United States, you don't even get out of your truck. You drop off your load. You turn. You come back into Canada. In Windsor, if you were to go into Detroit, not even get out of your truck, and you come back, you're now forced to quarantine for 14 days. How are you supposed to earn a living for your family? So the truckers had enough, and they said, "Fine, we're going to go to Ottawa. We're going to protest. Enough is enough. You're going to have to listen to us now." And then everybody else jumped onto that bandwagon, myself included, other veterans, doctors, lawyers, teachers, religious people. Like a lot of people within all of our society went to the convoy to support it.
One of the things that I heard early on too, which is interesting that it was truckers, and I always said, people wearing work boots, but it seemed to be there was also a backlash because they were deemed to be not as smart or not as intelligent as other people, which I found interesting, that working class people were deemed to be less than.
Yeah, well, hey, okay, if let's just say the society was to collapse tomorrow, who do you want to be standing beside when you want to rebuild? The history teacher or the guy who knows how to fix a telephone?
And the farmers.
Okay, the farmer.
Yeah.
who's going to feed you, or
Yeah.
the person who's going to clean your water, or the tradespeople that are going to build you shelter or fix your shelter. I'm sorry, but in that extreme case, I don't think we have room for academics. We need to rebuild. So, to say that, blue collar people are somehow less worthy because they don't have PhDs or master's degrees is kind of disgusting. I mean, blue collar is what built our society. They literally built it with their hands and they maintain it. I would argue, that they're probably more important than white collar.
Mhm.
I would argue. I mean, you look at a doctor, or a dentist, they are blue collar workers. They just earn a lot of money to do it. But in essence, they are blue collar workers.
Mhm.
They get work to the bone and they do things with their hands and their feet. This is the reality of it. And by the way, many dentists and doctors and PhDs were at the convoy, as well as ministers and all walks of life. And I want to say this: wasn't just Caucasians, it wasn't just Christians, it was Asians, it was Muslims, it was Hindus, it was Indians, it was Canadians, it was the melting pot that was at the convoy. CBC didn't want to report that, did they?
Well, again, I do know from other people I spoke to and interviewed that said the same thing to me, that it was not. In fact, one person I know that went, and this for me was something to help me better understand as a former journalist, because I wanted to hear, and I talked to people who went to Ottawa. Now, the other thing that gets blurred sometimes is we had what was happening in Ottawa. We had the blockade at the Windsor border, and then we had the Coutts border. So now, and I've heard this, that they all kind of have got lumped in together. And again, I talked to a lot of people because my first understanding, I thought what was happening in Windsor was connected to Ottawa. And then the more research I did, it came out that
Mm-hmm.
no, it wasn't. And I actually spoke to people in Windsor and I'm like, okay, yeah, no, they are not there. There's a whole different issue going on in
Mm-hmm.
each of these. So can you just give a synopsis of that from your perspective?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's very, very true, because in Ottawa, we knew that if we were in communications with the other protests, that actually, I would say they were inspired by what Ottawa was doing. They seized the moment and they held their own protests in their own provinces and in their own areas. They were inspired by the convoy, but the convoy never, ever had anything to do with giving direction or advice or anything to any of the other protests around the country. And I remember a good friend of mine was at Windsor, and I got one email or a text and about this, and all I said was, make sure that you keep that one lane open on the bridge, which they had a lane open on the bridge the entire time. And I said, and then the next thing is, don't contact me again. We're not going to be seen as a national coordination center for all the different protests, because I thought then they're going to say this is being coordinated out of Ottawa. This is now a much bigger event. We were smart enough to see that play. If we were viewed as a national coordination center, then the government would have tried to make a case of this is now a threat to, the security of Canada. And it was really, really depressing to see that the commissioner of the OPP, Tom Carrick, testified last year and said, yeah, I believe that this was a deliberate attempt to stretch police resources thin. And I thought that was a really disgusting, disingenuous thing for him to say on the stand, because he knew that we weren't coordinating with anybody other than him and his OPP people. We were involved, the convoy was involved as they were moving towards Ottawa. And I personally spoke to the OPP every single day at 10 o'clock. I had a standing phone call with the OPP. Okay, and I had several calls and texts and interactions with the Ottawa police throughout the day as well. So for him to get up there and say, we believe that it was some international conspiracy to stretch out the law enforcement is categorically and disgustingly false. And they know that it's false. They have no evidence to suggest that it was coordinated. And all these allegations of Russia and all that, that's all been disproven. That's all been testified to. And there's no evidence. GoFundMe and GiveSendGo also testified and said 88% of the donors to the convoy were in Canada. Okay. And there were Canadian citizens that were abroad because, you can send money from your phone if you're in Europe. You can donate to these platforms, even if you're in, let's say, Germany, and you're a Canadian on vacation or whatever it is, you can still donate to that convoy through these GoFundMe or crowdfunding platforms. Doesn't mean that you're a Russian trying to disrupt the democracy of Canada or Russian collusion. I mean, these arguments were all proven in committees with the members of parliament under Larry Brock. They were testified to at the Public Order Emergency Commission. This is something that has been proven categorically false many, many times over. But every once in a while, they still beat that drum because they know that Canadians, I hate to say it, but a lot of people that consume mainstream media never really truly question where they're getting that information from. If the mainstream media, and why do I believe this? Because you look at the pandemic itself, more families turned on each other. Fathers and mothers turned on their children, children turned on their parents, on their siblings, best friends, marriages were ruined because people gave more weight to what the anchor man said than they did to their own family and friends and their own blood relatives. Relationships were destroyed because people put more weight into what the CBC said than family members. And that's frustrating.
Yes.
That's very frustrating. And
yeah.
if you were to ask the public prior to the pandemic, do you believe that the legacy media lies? I'm sure the vast majority of Canadians went, oh yeah, of course they do. But in the case of the pandemic, they just ate it up. They ate it up.
Well, and as I look at the coverage as well as looking at, again, I look at when tables are turned because I look at this in how coverage of this and basically acceptance, you're right of, I did see a lot of coverage that seemed to fall in line with, when the Prime Minister said anybody that was in the convoy was racist, misogynist, white supremacist, and yet the people I talked to, they don't seem to fit into those categories. Quite a few people I spoke to weren't even political, but have become more political. And now we're at a situation, and this is where I have even more questions about what's happening with the erosion of trust in police, in public health, in media. Am I missing any group? What's the group? I'm politicians, right? So there to be people now have lost that. So any thoughts on maybe what next, or what does everything we've been talking about seems to go to that there was almost only one view. I can say this even for myself, when I was asking questions, it was almost, you weren't allowed to even ask questions about some of these things, which has always been my concern and why I'm a recovering journalist, is that we need to always be curious, ask questions, even the uncomfortable questions, even the questions that, may go against what the current government is saying. And that seems to have now entered a place of loss of trust.
Well, what I want to say is that overnight, it seems to me that every institution within our society that collectively makes a society, every single one of them failed drastically out of fear that was generated constantly and bombarded into the minds of Canadians who were just trying to get information, and they were turning to the media. But I knew there was a severe problem when I saw the censorship starting, because the moment they started using a phrase, trust the science, I knew something was drastically wrong. The very foundation of science is to question science.
Yeah.
And we're saying unequivocally trust that which should not be fully trusted. When we talk about credentialism, okay, look at a great case of Dr. Byron Bridle. Okay, he's a vaccinologist at the University of Guelph. He came out, he read a study that was published out of Japan. He read it on a news, he was being interviewed by Legacy Media. And the day he talked about the study, his career effectively was destroyed. They had the Ontario Science Table under Doug Ford. Members on that viciously attacked him. His own colleagues at the University of Guelph attacked him. They tried to get him fired. He was, under cancel culture. He several times challenged the Ontario Science Table to an open public debate. They would never do it. They won't talk about the science, right? Don't question the science. Don't ask questions. Just do what you're told. Okay. And this was a constant theme that was coming up. And if you are not allowed to question science, then it's not science. It's dogma. Be clear. It's dogma. That which shall not be questioned, that which shall be obeyed. And that's not how science works. Science is about asking questions and being inquisitive and making deductions based on evidence. So Byron Bridle basically came out and he said this, he talked about the study that happened in Japan. He was viciously crucified. Now, had he come out and advocated for vaccine, the man spent his entire career. He teaches at the University of Guelph on how to create vaccines. That's what he believes in vaccines. And he said, I make vaccines for a living. I teach other people how to do it. And he said, this is not meeting the definition of a vaccine. This is not doing what we think a vaccine should do. This is new technology never before used on people. And it's now in the studies that the Japanese are seeing, not doing what we expected it to do. And so had he come out on that interview and said, hey, this is great. This is really working. He'd be a household hero on the part of the legacy media. He'd be the guy they go to all the time for comment. He'd be the big advocate. But they can't attack his credentials. So what do? They attacked his character. Said that he was crazy. He's a nut job. He's a right-wing extremist, right? We use emotional arguments to attack somebody of science. We go after his character. We can't go after his credentials. And this is what we were seeing all of the time in legacy media. And Justin Trudeau was the master of this. He couldn't say doctors, lawyers, scientists, retired military college professors, priests, pastors were all on their way to Ottawa to protest. He said a small fringe minority with unacceptable views who are oftentimes misogynists are on their way to Ottawa. He used an attack on the character of these people. He didn't talk about the credentials of who was on the way. And it's dangerous.
You know what? One of the things early on, and I don't even know I probably wouldn't even be able to have this show a couple of years ago, right? Which is, to me, is also very disturbing as a journalist that, our job is to ask questions. Our job is to dig deep. And one of the things early on that I always have felt and continues to feel is missing, and it's missing on a lot of topics, is why. Like, we very seldom have we heard through any of this. We've heard, you said, yes, the, calling people names, right, is it's one approach, but I don't really like that, even if against people that I don't agree with. There's been many times I don't agree with people, but I still value their right to have that view and have a different view than mine, because I always said it would be a pretty boring world, or I said might explode in flames if everybody was like me. But the why, what that seems to be missed as to why so many people would have left homes, given up businesses, given up work to travel across Canada. And usually what I hear is that, well, they wanted to overthrow the government, but I haven't seen any evidence of that, other than someone once said there was someone that mailed something. They said, geez, if you're going to overthrow the government, you probably wouldn't send it through Canada Post. But there was the MOU. And
I can talk about that.
Okay, if you can talk about that. A lot of people, that's often what I hear, is that, well, they wanted to overthrow the government. I'm like, I haven't seen any evidence
Yeah.
of that, and I always like to make my
Mhm.
decisions based on evidence. So.
I actually have a chapter about the MOU in the book, because I spent a lot of time talking to the people that drafted the MOU. In fact, one of the authors of the MOU was the reason I was called to go to the convoy. I didn't know who he was. I had no idea who he was. It was a person who I was put in touch with through a friend of mine, to have a phone call. And the next thing you know, during the course of that phone call, I made a commitment to go for a couple days, I thought, and to help out, just to go there, make a sustainment plan, pass it off to somebody else and come home. As a result, I stayed for 22 days. Now, let me say this. The MOU was a document that was drafted long before the convoy was even a consideration. Okay. It was something that was written by 2 truck drivers. It was not written by lawyers. It was, a request that the Governor General intervene on behalf of Canadians. There's no threat in the MOU. I've read the MOU. It, as far as I can tell, it is in no way, and why I know this is because no charges were ever pressed against the people that submitted the MOU. Okay, it is not illegal to send a letter to the Governor General asking her to dissolve Parliament. And yes, the MOU was sent to the Governor General through registered mail. Does that sound like a violent overthrow of the government? No. And you know what? During the convoy, when the media grabbed hold of the MOU, they actually did a public statement and they retracted it. The authors of the MOU retracted it during the convoy. Okay. And there was no violence. I mean, I said that violence in the city of Ottawa until the police showed up on the 18th and 19th of February was down crime was down 90% in the city. And there was only 5 arrests for violent crime up until that time. From the convoy arriving on the 28th of January to the police violently arresting protesters starting on the 18th, there was 5 arrests in the city of Ottawa for violent crime. Okay, we weren't storming any buildings. We weren't trying to get into any buildings. We were down on Wellington, nowhere near the doors of Parliament. We weren't fighting with police. In fact, we were trying to get more onto Wellington in front of the Parliament buildings with the cooperation of the city, by the way. We had a deal with the city to move the trucks out of the residential areas and up onto Wellington. The reason the trucks ended up in the residential areas is that's where the police led the truckers when they arrived in Ottawa, put them in the residential areas. So we were fighting for weeks with the city to move the trucks up onto Wellington, right there in front of Parliament. That's what we wanted. And by the way, we had porta potties. So this rumor about people pooping on lawns and stuff, I'll tell you where that comes from. We rented porta potties up on Wellington. The police refused to allow us to get a pumper truck to clean those out. Okay, so that's another, the city put us into some awful situations, and then we got blamed for the behavior that we had nothing to do with. Okay, but ultimately, there was never any intention. I publicly gave media statements where I said, I've got a table, let's sit down together and find a way out of this. And now one thing I got smeared with, because I made a statement on the 7th of February, is saying, I've got a table, come and sit with me, form a coalition government and find a way to get something going here. Okay. This is what I publicly said. You know how the media spun it? They said Tom is an unelected official who is saying he wants to be part of the government and to form a coalition with other parties to overthrow the elected government. He's not an elected official. Bill Blair said stupid stuff like that. I never said any such thing. What I said was, you guys come at a table, you figure out how to make a coalition to come together and get some change in this country. And I got accused viciously of trying to be an unelected official and overthrow the government. You know what was happening during the convoy? The NDP and the Liberal government were solidifying their coalition government that they put together, because quickly after the convoy, they signed the deal and they released it to the public, and they had been working on that. They had already formed a coalition government that gave and has given Justin Trudeau a minority-ruled government. since the convoy because the NDP have given it to him. And then I got accused of saying that I was trying as an unelected official to form a government with the Conservatives, the Bloc, the NDP, and whoever else would help get a meeting with the government of Canada. We just wanted a meeting. You know, the highest ranking person I spoke to was the city manager. I had 2 meetings he was in attendance for. The second was a Superintendent Drummond from the Ottawa Police, and he wasn't really an active participant very much in that meeting. But regularly, the highest ranking person I dealt with the entire time, any of us, was a sergeant in the Ottawa Police liaison team. That's it. That's all would speak to us.
Well, Tom, I want to put something up here for people that
Sure.
may be interested in learning more. You have a book that's been
I do.
out since the fall and available through Amazon. I did a quick perusal of sort of the highlights. It sounds like some good background, I think, from people that want to hear more. One of the things I encourage with everybody always is, to, as Ted Lasso says, be curious, not judgmental. So first of all, and I have in the background, this is part of my branding, go sign up, suit up, and show up. And one of the things when I work with clients, when it comes to public relations is, first you have to have the right mindset. You have to decide you want to do something. Then the suit up part, that's so important. You have to do research, and not only the research that aligns with your own views. So I say this to clients as well. You need to, do your research, and then you can show up. And one of the things I've learned about you, I've been following you for quite a while, is that you definitely did your sign up, suit up, and then you showed up. I want to thank you for showing up today on this show and giving some background. And for people listening, watching, you may not agree with everything, but I hope that people will maybe give some thought to seeing another perspective. You're not someone that's just woke up one day and decided to just start railing on about these things. You actually have done a lot of research, and I would encourage. Now there's I'm going to put up. Let me see a banner here. Let me get up. Hold on just a minute. Let me see, where did that go? Here we go. I'm going to show that. Let me see if I can. I don't know if I can. No, I can't show it.
I can see it.
You can see it. Yeah, we're over here. Hello. There's a book. If you go over to the other side, see, we can.
Yeah.
So this is the cover of the book. Again, the People's Emergency Act, Freedom Convoy 2022. One of the things I think it's so important is we need to have more discussions about this rather than less. And we could, talk a great deal more, but I hope that at least we can look at the, the ruling and what will happen next. Though that will be stories still to unfold. And there's lots of information out there. I encourage people to go read different perspectives about what is happening. But also, from this show, I know I learned a lot, even about that whole MOU. And that, I knew a little bit, but I was, because I've done some research into that. And the other thing is I encourage people to really learn more about history and understanding the difference between US and Canada, because there is a very big difference. And you have to understand history in order to understand culture, in order to understand, mindset as well of Canadians versus Americans. There is a reason they're done differently. So any final words? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess my final thought was, you may not support the convoy, and that's okay.
Right.
Nobody has an issue with that. But just ask important questions like, why did everybody go to Ottawa? Why was it supported? Why did it twice raise over $10 million in support? Why did people line the highways? What is it about all those people that they were thinking that maybe you're not aware of? The other thing I would say is research what informed consent is. It is sacrosanct in medical law. When I talked about informed consent, there's 2 pieces. It's a 2-part formula. A medical practitioner must give you the information about the risks. You, as the patient, must give consent. And when your employer dictates to you that if you don't have a job, unless you participate in a medical intervention that you may not want, that's actually coercion. That's against the law. That's assault. And so when you look at all of those things, you have to start to ask the questions like, why would everybody go through the trouble instead of just rolling up their sleeve and doing it? It's because we didn't know the risks and we weren't going to subject ourselves to an experimental intervention that we didn't want to participate until the medical community could establish a baseline safety. And they can't. They still, to this day, they can't. And the last thing I'm going to say, talk to Eastern Europeans that have immigrated to Canada in the last 30 years. Talk to them. Have candid conversations about what their life was like in their former countries and the way they see things happening in Canada here. Because the Eastern Europeans, if you talk to them, they will surprise you. They want to tell their stories and they want to tell you about the things that they're seeing happen in this country and how they happened in their countries. Talk to them. They will be honest.
Well, talk to them, get curious, do your research. Those are all things I definitely celebrate and applaud. And I also want to just, for my wrap up, to say too that, going back to what we first talked about on the show was the federal court ruling, the Emergencies Act was unconstitutional. So regardless of where you may fall on mandates or the convoy, I think the question is really around how, something like the act could be used in the future. That's always what I look at. I said, whether you agree or disagree with any issue, one day this could be against a topic or a protest or a belief you're in. And so that is what I encourage everybody to go take some time, really look at this, and then, replace liberal with conservative or whatever other party you believe in, and also whatever other topic. Think about what topic you really believe strongly about and how would you feel if this was used against that. Because that to me it's like free speech censorship. I always say you got to be aware. Don't look at it only from your perspective. You really have to look at it and remove some of the emotion. And so that's how. So Tom, thank you for your time today. One last question maybe is just, how do you exercise your curious mind? Sometimes when I'm doing this show, I always like to ask people, quite apart from anything we even talked about today, I always talk about, I cycle, I go to the gym. I like to do things to sort of strengthen that curiosity muscle as well.
I wish that I was exercising more. I know I need to. We have a dog, so we walk the dog. When we get to the land, we would like to someday build a house on the land. I know we'll be doing a lot more exercising on the land. I'm a nature freak. I like to be out in the woods. That's where I like to be. Unfortunately, where I am, that's not so easy, not impossible. But when I go to the land that I have, that is where my mental health really, really takes hold of my entire being. So I just like to be in nature walking.
That's great. That is, walking and, exercising, those curious minds can come in many different forms. So, and I'm sure writing your book was also part of that too. So, if you want to, after even drop a link one of us can drop a link into the comments here. And if people want to go directly to Amazon, purchase the book, support you. And, even if you don't agree with Tom, maybe read the book and open up your mind. So, Tom, I just have you go to the green room.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in and getting curious about this topic, this big news event that happened this week, which was the federal court ruling, the Emergencies Act, in regard to the Ottawa convoy was ruled unconstitutional. And I encourage everybody to go take some time, really understand separating everything away from partisanship, away from whether you like the Liberals, don't like the Liberals. Look at this from the aspect of how decisions are made, how rules are enacted, because this is now precedent setting, and it does indicate how we will go forward as a country, how we will go forward as people looking at being able to express different views, express different philosophies on whatever the topic of the day is. So I want to definitely thank Tom for coming on the show, and we'll drop a link about his book. And I encourage everybody, even if you don't agree with Tom, maybe dig a little deeper, and it's always good to see things from another perspective. Okay, have a great day, night, morning to everyone, and keep following, subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on other Curious Minds topics. We'll be having more. We're going to be also talking about some manufacturing and the economy and how that impacts Canada as well. So stay tuned for that's going to be an upcoming show as well. Okay, thanks everybody.